Reproduction, what is it and why does it happen, and of course how does it happen, is the subject of this next unit, and we will be talking today in this first section about the definition of reproduction, and we will look at two different major types of reproduction and give some examples of those and elaborate a little bit on the whole concept of reproduction as a biological process. To start with, reproduction can be thought of as a process by which organisms create more organisms that are similar to themselves. A cell, for example, when it reproduces, it makes more cells. An oak tree, when it reproduces, makes more oak trees. And of course, we humans, when we reproduce, we usually make more humans. That's just the way life works. It seems to be sort of a fundamental aspect of life. It's built in and hardwired, this drive to reproduce. And it's of course found throughout the living world, and life without the drive to reproduce is pretty much unimaginable, because any population of animals or plants or fungi or any population of any living thing that didn't have the drive to reproduce most likely would not reproduce. And then of course if they don't reproduce, then they go the way of animals that don't exist anymore. They become extinct. The process itself can be either sexual or asexual, and most of us are familiar with the sexual type of reproduction. And so we'll spend some time first talking about the asexual type and compare it to sexual, and why sexual reproduction has its advantages and disadvantages, and asexual reproduction as likewise has its set of advantages and disadvantages. Ultimately, however, all reproduction happens at the cellular level, and in that sense, reproduction is always asexual from the cellular point of view, in that all reproduction involves a single cell that somehow divides itself into two cells, and in the end, that is something that a cell has to do by itself, and therefore it is asexual, even if that cell is the result of some mix of genetic material from other sources. It doesn't negate the fact that that cell has to ultimately, in its own body, divide itself somehow into two different cells. And that actually brings us to the first type of reproduction. Asexual reproduction is involving a single parent. The offspring of an asexual reproduction doesn't have a mommy and a daddy. It doesn't even have a mommy or a daddy. It doesn't even have, in many cases, doesn't really even have a parent anymore. And instead, the parents have simply become the offspring. The offspring of asexual reproduction are generally identical to the parent, and therefore they are also genetically identical to each other in most cases. We'll talk about what some exceptions to that might be in a little bit. Single-celled organisms and some multicellular organisms reproduce asexually. Most organisms are capable of some kind of sexual reproduction at some point in their lives. This all sort of depends on semantics to some extent, because the word sexual has some sort of specialized definition, and there's some disagreement as to whether we should call conjugation among bacteria, should we call that sexual or asexual activity, and that again depends on how you define the terms. The simplest type of asexual reproduction involves a cell simply splitting in two. Now there are obviously steps that are required for this to happen. In general, a cell will do this once it has grown to a certain size, if there's sufficient resources in its environment, and if it has the ingredients and the materials that it needs in order to replicate its DNA and to run the machinery of cellular division, then it will divide. This is particularly common among bacteria and other single-celled organisms. As you can see in this diagram, a single cell is in the process of becoming two cells, and so at the end of that result there are not three cells, there are only two cells. And in a sense, the parent becomes the daughter cells, as you can see in this diagram. Mitosis is, or more properly perhaps mitotic cell division, is a form of cell division, therefore it's a form of reproduction, or it's a process that has to happen before reproduction can occur in eukaryotic cells, because eukaryotic cells have a nucleus, and mitosis, strictly speaking, refers to the division of the nucleus into two parts. So the splitting of the nucleus, which is then followed by binary fission or cytokinesis if we're talking about the individual cells of a multicellular organism. Secondly, we see in the example of this water hydra, you can see this is an animal, by the way. It's not a plant, even though it looks green in this picture. And what you see is the major part of the adult, or the parent, is the larger structure here with the tentacles coming out. And off to the side, circled in red, you can see the offspring. That's a baby hydra, if you will, sprouting, although again it's not a plant, so sprouting is probably not the right word. Budding is obviously the correct term, budding off of the side of the parent hydra in this case. The baby hydra, the clone really of the adult hydra, can sometimes stay attached to the parent for quite a while. They can form colonies of these clonal copies of the parent, or they can break away at times and sort of become their own free living, or find their own places to attach to other structures in the pond water, and therefore will then go through their own budding process and produce their own offspring, which will be clones of themselves, and by extension, therefore, also clones of the original adult. All right, that's budding in a multicellular animal. Budding can also occur in single-celled organisms. Here we see a picture of yeasts, just common yeast that they use to make bread, or that are found floating around in the atmosphere and so on. These cells are capable of budding, and in this case it's a little bit like binary fission, but instead of splitting into two equally sized cells, here we can see that the parent cell, the red circle shows sort of the beginning of a process, and the other cells, you can see sort of various states of this occurring. It starts as a small bud that grows out of the cytoplasm of the original yeast, and you can see as well the cytoplasm cell membrane of the original yeast, and then you can see it getting a little bit bigger and starting to break away, and ultimately at the bottom of the screen you see two yeast cells, the parent and the daughter cell. And what distinguishes this from binary fission is largely the fact that the daughter cells are not equally sized, and so you have one. Well, then in this case we talk about the parent cell giving rise to a single daughter cell. Another form of multicellular reproduction that is asexual is vegetative propagation. As the name implies, this is something that we apply, a word that we use mainly in referring to plants, and it's sometimes it's a artificial form of reproduction that if you have house plants, you can, in many cases, if you do it right, and it may vary from one plant to another, but the way it is done precisely, but generally you want to take a piece of one plant and cut it off and either plant it directly in the soil or put it in water and allow it time to start growing roots. So the cells that were once part of the stem will then reorient themselves or repurpose themselves and begin expressing the genes and taking on the role of being cells that will turn into roots, and then it will obviously then it is its own individual plant that is derived from a parent cell, and so forth. It will be genetically identical to the parent from which it was cut. And we have the process called regeneration, and regeneration is something that has a more general definition of being a way of repairing or replacing lost parts. But in some cases, animals that instead of replacing just a lost part, the lost part can replace the rest of the body that's also missing. In the case of the sea star that you see here, if one of the arms is cut off, and a little bit, if enough of the central section of the starfish is included in the part that's cut off, then that central section will begin to grow back. It will regenerate the missing part of the central section, and it will regenerate the missing limbs, so that instead of having one starfish, you now have two starfish from a starfish that was damaged or was injured in such a way that it lost one of its arms in the right way. Okay, this is fairly common in other animals as a means of regenerating a lost part. So you may have recalled you may have heard stories or seen in nature shows or even witnessed yourself. You may have seen lizards that are running away from a predator, and the predator snatches the tail falls off, and the predator sits there playing with the tail that's still wiggling on the ground while the lizard runs away. The lizard will then regenerate that missing tail. However, that missing tail will not obviously be able to regenerate the missing lizard that it was once attached to. So that would be a form of regenerating a lost limb, but that is not a way of regenerating or of reproducing in those particular species. So as a form of reproduction, it's relatively rare. The last one's also quite rare. It's called parthenogenesis, and partheno, if you've heard of the Parthenon in Athens, and so partheno actually refers to a maiden or a virgin, depending on the context. And so genesis, means birth or beginnings, and so parthenogenesis means, loosely translated, means virgin birth. And that is a situation where there are animals that are capable of producing offspring that they are normally sexually reproducing animals, but under certain circumstances they're able to reproduce without fertilization, without the use of a mate. And it's sort of a borderline between sexual and non-sexual or asexual, in part because the offspring are sometimes not identical to the parent, and in fact are unique in their own way, and so therefore they would sort of be not quite fitting the definition of asexual and not quite fitting the definition of sexual either. It all depends on how the parthenogenesis occurs, and that's variable in different species. The ant that you see pictured here, and I won't even attempt to pronounce that name, I haven't practiced it, but this is a species of ant, and there are a couple of other species around the world that have evolved the same strategy, where there are in fact no males of this species. So these would be called obligate parthenogenesis, and that means that they are only capable of reproducing by parthenogenesis. They are not capable of having sexual reproduction because, in the strict sense, because the males are no longer a part of this species. Okay, and that will wrap up the discussion of asexual reproduction, and I'll stop there. I want to keep these videos kind of short, so next section 2 on reproduction we will move to the concept of sexual